American culture, social life, and politics underwent a radical transformation during the 1960s. Groups that traditionally had little power challenged traditional authorities and ways of ordering work, education, families, and private life. They also forged new ethnic and racial identities. A new feminist movement arose to demand economic and social equality and sexual freedom for women. Opposition to the war in Vietnam, which reached a crescendo during the climactic year of 1968, profoundly influenced the course of other protest movements. Many young people came to see themselves constrained by an uncaring society dominated by a self-satisfied establishment. Their exuberant flowering of racial, gender, sexual, and cultural protest, known as a counterculture, excited millions. But the counterculture also provoked a fierce backlash from an equal, if not larger, number of Americans.
Don't be afraid. Don't be ashamed. We want black power. 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 That's right. That's what we want. Black power. And we don't have to be ashamed of it. We have stayed here and we begged the president. We begged the federal government. That's all we've been doing. Begging, begging. It's time we stand up and take over. Take over. We have to do what every group in this country did. We got to take over the communities where we outnumber people so we can have decent jobs. So we can have decent houses. So we can have decent roads. So we can have decent schools. So we can have decent justice. Every courthouse in Mississippi ought to be burned down tomorrow to get rid of the dirt and filth. Now from now on, when they ask you what you want, you know what to tell them. What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? Everybody, what do you want? That's what we gonna get.
Race riots since those 2 years ago in the Watts section of Los Angeles rocked New Jersey's largest city, Newark, for 5 consecutive days and nights. At least 24 persons are killed. More than 1,800 wounded.
So Newark was a hotbed for change.
American cities were in crisis situations.
I mean, I got beat. I thought I was going to get killed, actually.
The riots at the time seemed to me to be a rebellion, an understandable rebellion against racism, against police brutality.
We haven't owned up to what happened to our cities.
We knew about Watts, we knew about, I can't remember who came first, but so there was always that sense of what's going to happen here.
Bad housing, bad services.
And then all of a sudden you've got riots and fear. It's no wonder that people decide, we're out of here.
And so we lived through a terrible time.
26 people altogether.
I don't know if Newark has fully recovered from it.
No, don't tell me about history unless you tell the truth.
But probably the bigger truth is that Newark is a city that's been victimized like so many other cities.
As wild a joint as America is,
you have to know what happened.
On July the 12th of 1967, an ordinary traffic infraction was committed by a cab driver.
A person with a classic name, the kind of name that slaves were given, John Smith.
Here you have a large public housing project across the street. And now you have white policemen who seem to be beating up this guy as they're taking him in to the police station.
On top of cars and say they were going to go downtown and riot. And we stood there and say, if you do that, you're going to end up being killed. If you do that, you're going to get shot. Don't do that.
But somebody threw a Molotov cocktail.
And the situation on the streets of Newark is indeed out of control. There's looting and there are fires going on.
Let me set the stage for that period. In Newark at that time, there were practically no black anything. There were no black bus drivers. There were few black policemen. So in a period between 63 and 64, we sort of got motivated by what was happening in the South.
1945 until really into the 70s, the suburbs were white territory, thanks to government action.
You had the bank redlining under Roosevelt. Actually created maps where they literally drew red lines around a block with the presence of just one black person.
So here are a bunch of black folks up here. looking for jobs in the industrial sector. Suddenly they got here, and there was nothing here. It was like an old bait and switch routine.
By morning of July 14th, the state police are rolling into the city. And by noon, the New Jersey National Guard. Then you have the second part of the riot, which is the looting has pretty much stopped, but the killing has just begun.
In what was a barrage of firing by National Guardsmen and state police, when someone shouted, and they trained the guns on that roof and began firing.
There was an individual deep within a vacant bank who must have thought that I was firing at him. He had an automatic weapon in his hand, and what he did was fire at me.
It turns out that this is a sequence of photos, and in the next couple of photos you see that one has a shotgun, he's wearing a yellow hard hat like a construction hat, and takes aim at my friend and shoots him.
You had Watson 65. You had Jersey City, people don't talk about that, Harlem, and then you had Detroit and Newark almost the same time.
By the middle of the decade, the focus shifted from the struggle against legal segregation in the South to other forms of racial discrimination across the country. Many urban blacks outside the South felt that civil rights legislation failed to solve their most pressing problems. Young African Americans believed racial discrimination prevented them from fair access to jobs, housing, credit, transportation, education, and equal treatment from police. They thought that traditional civil rights organizations paid too much attention to ending legal segregation and too little to the crushing burden of poverty. More militant African American groups, such as the Congress of Racial Equality, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Nation of Islam, rejected the style of traditional civil rights leaders as weak, accommodating, and unsuccessful. More militant, often younger African Americans advocated what they called Black Power, a combination of racial pride and forceful, even violent resistance to anti-black violence. This more militant assertion of rights and willingness to use whatever means necessary split the Civil Rights Coalition. It also produced and intensified the white backlash against the political, social, and economic gains made by African Americans. The civil rights movement experienced a major turning point in 1965. The dignity shown by civil rights marchers in Selma, Alabama, in the face of unspeakable police and National Guard brutality, galvanized nationwide support for passage of the Voting Rights Act. But on August 11th, 5 days after Johnson signed the act into law, violence broke out in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles. A crowd protesting the arrest of a young African-American driver began to throw rocks and bottles at police in the streets of this poor African-American section of the city. For the next 6 days, thousands of residents set fires, looted white-owned businesses, attacked white drivers, and fought the more than 15,000 police and National Guardsmen requested by California officials to restore order. The outburst resulted in 34 people dead, nearly all of them African Americans. The shocking violence of Watts terrified and confused many white Americans, but many African Americans understood the frustration and rage. Rioting continued in major American cities throughout the rest of the 1960s. In 1966, the National Guard patrolled Cleveland, Chicago, and Washington, D.C., and other cities. In 1967, a particularly long, hot summer resulted in 164 conflicts, including 8 major riots. The most intense clashes occurred in Newark and Detroit, where 43 people died, most of them shot by police or National Guardsmen.
Six days of rioting in a Negro section of Los Angeles left behind scenes reminiscent of war-torn cities. More than 100 square blocks were decimated by fire and looters, and few buildings were left intact. Firemen were harassed by snipers and brick-throwing hoodlums as they attempted to control the fires, many of which were left to burn themselves out. As the National Guard moved in to restore comparative calm, the losses by fire alone were put at $200 million. No attempt has yet been made to estimate the losses suffered at the hands of the looters who stole everything from liquor to playpens.
Conservative and middle-class whites, often blaming the riots on outside agitators and undisciplined black youth looking for a thrill, wanted police to act forcefully against rioters. Many turned against the urban social programs of the Great Society, which they believed rewarded rioters, and threatened their suburbs. By the mid-1960s, some younger civil rights activists had grown frustrated with the nonviolent, integrationist approach of moderate leaders. Continued violence against blacks, extreme poverty, and the slow pace of change drove many to embrace more radical measures. In 1966, for instance, SNCC leader Stokely Carmichael forced the issue of black power to the center of white America's consciousness. Carmichael and others turned to the black nationalist ideas of Minister Malcolm X for inspiration. After his release from prison in 1952 for petty larceny, Malcolm had joined the Nation of Islam, often referred to as the Black Muslims. Malcolm promoted separatism because, he believed, white racism would never end. He also encouraged pride in African Americans' cultural heritage, supporting black businesses and self-defense. Later, Malcolm left the Nation of Islam, embraced traditional Islam, moderated his anti-white stance slightly, and formed the Organization for Afro-American Unity. In early 1965, he was assassinated by 3 black Muslims angry that he had left their organization. Although SNCC served as the early leading black power group, the Black Panther Party gained the most notoriety. Founded in Oakland in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, members of the Black Panthers advocated black self-determination and armed self-defense against police brutality. Their shootouts with police, which resulted in several deaths on both sides, captured the close attention of the media and frightened many whites. Although they also developed health, education, and nutrition programs, their influence faded by the early 1970s.